You are a royal eunuch in the palace of Hansong in the year 1762. The crown prince still breathes, but your duty is to witness his death. You have been summoned to the courtyard of Changdu-kung on a day so hot that the stones themselves seem to burn through your sandals. Before you stands King Yeongjo, his face heavy with grief, and beside him the wooden rice chest into which his only son will be sealed alive. The command has been given. You hear the lid close, and with it, the echoes of a dynasty's deepest shame. The thing that defined this execution was not just its cruelty, but its symbolism. To strike a crown prince with the sword would desecrate royal blood, but to starve him in silence was to preserve the throne's dignity while destroying the man who threatened it. The chest itself became a tomb, a coffin of grain transformed into an instrument of dynastic survival. As you listen to Sado's muffled pleas stretch into the night, you realize you're not simply witnessing the death of a prince. You are hearing the collapse of a life scarred by torment, paranoia, and acts so violent they nearly unraveled Joseon rule. His end was a punishment, but also a preservation, one father's desperate measure to protect a kingdom from his son's madness. And before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. To understand Crown Prince Sado, you must first understand the world he was born into, not shaped by divine wrath or sorcery, but by the suffocating demands of Confucian monarchy and the crushing weight of dynastic expectation. He entered life on February 13, 1735, in the royal palaces of Hansong. His name? Isun, the second son of King Yeongjo and royal noble consort Yeong. When his elder brother died in infancy, the path to succession opened, and the one-year-old boy was made crown prince, a fragile child suddenly bound to the survival of an entire dynasty. His was a childhood that looked gilded from the outside but was poisoned within. The Joseon court was a battlefield of factions, Noron against Soron, scholars against courtiers, where every gesture could be interpreted as treachery. Yeongjo, haunted by conspiracies that had nearly cost him his throne, watched his only son with relentless scrutiny. What should have been the tender guidance of a father became public interrogations, rebukes shouted across the throne hall, and humiliations delivered in front of servants and ministers. The boy who should have been celebrated as heir was instead treated as a reminder of the brother Yeongjo had lost. By all accounts, Sado had talent. He read quickly, wrote elegantly, and could discuss classics with fluency, rare even among scholars. His mother, Lady Hyegyeong, doted on him, proud of a son who had seemed destined to rule wisely. But Yeongjo was never satisfied. At every mistake, he was scolded in front of retainers. At every achievement, he was reminded he was still not good enough. To the crown prince, the palace was not a home but a stage, and every failure an audience's laughter in disguise. The seeds of fear were sown early. In 1745, when he was 10 years old, Sado was struck by a sudden illness that left him fainting in the middle of lessons. His recovery was incomplete. From that year on, whispers followed him. The boy had spells. The boy saw things no one else could see. Courtiers muttered about his constitution being too weak for rule. His father saw only confirmation of incompetence. What doctors call fainting fits, Lady Hyegyeong would later describe in her memoirs as terrors that clung to him into adulthood. He began to dread enclosed spaces. He startled at sudden noises. At night, he spoke of visions that chilled his attendants. Thunder gods, fiery eyes in the rafters, omens of divine punishment. It was not only sickness, but imagination feeding on sickness, and books like the Ochugyong, Taoist text he read in secret, gave his hallucinations form. He told of bolts of lightning flashing before him, though the skies were clear. The crown prince's mind was not breaking all at once, but bending under pressure, illness, and expectation. Every reprimand from his father drove him further inward. Every hallucination convinced him the gods themselves mocked his weakness. And every whisper from ministers convinced him he was surrounded not by tutors and advisors, but by spies waiting for his downfall. Even in childhood, he learned to hide his inner storms. He smiled when commanded, bowed when expected, but behind closed doors, he raged at invisible enemies and wept at the thought of being unloved. It was a boyhood not of joy, but of dread, a training ground not for leadership, but for paranoia. And those early cracks in his mind would widen with age until they split apart the palace itself. Sado, for his part, seemed almost dutiful in public, bowing low, reciting the classics, and attending the morning court with an air of studied obedience. But public rituals ended, and private terrors began. The first signs of real disturbance appeared not in matters of policy, but in his chambers, when attendants noticed his growing horror of clothing. He would demand robe after robe, layering himself in silks only to rip them off in panic, cursing the fabric and ordering entire bundles burned before his eyes. Servants whispered that the Crown Prince was afflicted with vestophobia, a fear so consuming that it transformed dressing into an ordeal. The palace did not understand these rituals, but they were assured they were necessary for his peace of mind. Eunuchs fetched fresh garments at all hours, seamstresses labored endlessly, and closets emptied into flames in the name of calming the air. What began as nervous fussing over collars became a spectacle of destruction, where anyone who faltered in meeting his demands might be struck with a rod or worse. Lady Hyegyeong, his wife, later wrote that clothing became for him not protection, but prison, a symbol that suffocated him until rage was the only release. Sado's education had been steeped in reverence for heaven, and perhaps that reverence curled into terror. By his 20s, he was said to shrink at the sound of thunder. Lightning in the sky sent him diving under roofs, trembling like a child. He avoided paintings of storm deities, refused to look at drums carved with thunder motifs, and insisted that even distant rumbles foretold doom. The irony was bitter. While he was meant to embody the mandate of heaven, he was instead paralyzed by its symbols. His father, King Yeongjo, saw in these fears not illness, but weakness. During Sado's regency years, beginning in 1749, the young prince was entrusted with matters of governance. Yet Yeongjo found fault at every turn. Sado was barred from conducting ancestral rites, forbidden to preside over key ceremonies, and shamed before ministers for the smallest mistakes. To be crown prince was supposed to mean reverence. For Sado, it meant humiliation. Every criticism chipped at him. Every reprimand deepened his suspicion that his father had never intended him to rule. The psychological toll was devastating. Lady Hyegyeong described moments when Sado could not even enter his father's presence without breaking into a sweat, his face drained of blood, his speech faltering. What appeared to the court as incompetence was, in truth, terror, a son who could not breathe beneath his father's gaze. In private, the fear twisted into fury. Shut out from rituals that affirmed authority, he invented his own, punishing servants, overturning protocol, and whispering threats to those who doubted him. The crown prince learned to smile through clenched teeth, to bow low even as his mind seethed. But behind the mask, the bitterness grew. He began to see enemies everywhere, even in those who meant him no harm. To his father, he was unworthy. To his ministers, he was unstable. To his wife, he was increasingly frightening. And to himself, he was a prisoner, trapped in a palace that mocked him at every turn. What began with phobias and paranoia was no passing affliction. It was the spark of fire that would consume not only Sado's life, but the lives of those around him. And as his father withdrew trust and the court withdrew respect, Sado withdrew into shadows of his own making. The worst was still coming. People really were whispering about his instability, but Sado's response was disproportionate and increasingly brutal. He began lashing out at those closest to him, drawing up mental lists of attendants who had displeased him, and punishing them in ways that shocked even hardened courtiers. By 1757, grief after the deaths of Queen Inwon and Queen Joseon had curdled into violence. That same year, he killed a eunuch with his own hands, severed the head, and forced court ladies and his wife to look upon it. It was not only a murder, but a performance, a message that his inner storms could no longer be contained. These attacks did not end there. They multiplied. Palace records and Lady Hyegyeong's memoirs described how he beat servants with clubs, struck eunuchs with swords, and killed attendants for what he called releasing emotions. It was grief turned outward, fury made flesh. The palace, once a place of rigid ceremony, became a theater of fear, where footsteps in the wrong corridor or hesitation in the wrong task could mean death. Ministers did not joke of it openly, but everyone knew the crown prince was unpredictable and increasingly uncontrollable. Even his own family was not safe. In 1760, Sado berated his mother and children with a cruelty that chilled those who heard it. He threatened Princess Hwahwan with a drawn sword, his own sister, once a companion of his youth. The threat was so sudden, so savage that those present froze, unsure if they were about to see royal blood spilled in the palace itself. Lady Hyegyeong wrote that she feared for her children every day, never knowing when his rage would turn toward them. By 1761, his fury turned inward upon his consorts. That year, while dressing, he flew into a rage at royal noble consort Gyeong, a woman once chosen for him by the royal household. He beat her to death, with his bare hands. No attempt was made to conceal it, no apology was offered. A prince who should have guarded the dignity of the inner court had transformed it into a place of terror, where women who bore his children could be slain as though they were servants. The wider impact was devastating. Servants crept through corridors like hunted animals, eunuchs avoided his gaze, and palace maids whispered prayers not to be summoned. His violence spread beyond the women's quarters and the servants' halls. He threatened officials, attempted to breach restricted archives, and stalked courtyards as though searching for enemies. Ministers who once dismissed him as a troubled son now spoke in hushed tones of a danger to the dynasty itself. But the violence was only beginning. What had started with the killing of a eunuch and the beating of servants would soon escalate into patterns of coercion and taboo breaking that left scars across the entire court. The palace was no longer only a place of fear, it was becoming a place of horror, and for those within its walls, the worst was still coming. It was finding new consorts that seemed for a moment to offer Sado a chance to satisfy the expectations that had haunted him from childhood. The court paired him early with Lady Hyegyeong in 1744 when he was just 10 years old, a marriage that looked harmonious on paper but concealed a growing abyss. As he aged, he began adding secondary wives, first Royal Noble Consort Suk in 1754 and then Royal Noble Consort Yeong in 1757, the latter a woman who had once attended his grandmother. The union was seen as scandalous, a violation of taboo that blurred the lines of propriety in a dynasty defined by rigid order. His private behavior had become inseparable from his public failings. The man who faltered in ritual and governance now turned intimacy into another stage for domination. He coerced court women into his chambers, beating those who resisted until they submitted, leaving bruises that were hidden behind silk sleeves. Consort Suk, while pregnant, was forced to take a board of medicines to end the life within her, an act that would have succeeded if not for Lady Hyegyeong's secret intervention to protect the child. These were not whispered rumors. They came from Hyegyeong's own memoirs, writing decades later with the precision of one who had survived them. The damage was not confined to his secondary wives. Lady Hyegyeong herself bore the weight of his temper. In one notorious incident, he hurled a heavy gold board at her face, leaving her with bruises she concealed behind careful layers of powder. For a crown princess who was meant to embody dignity, the humiliation of hiding wounds became part of her daily existence. Court women lived not with affection but with fear, each night uncertain if they would face embrace or violence. The palace, outwardly serene, had become a place where intimacy resembled punishment. Sado blurred lines between desire and rage, using relationships to vent his paranoia. Royal Noble Consort Yeong's death at his hands in 1761, beaten in a fit of rage as she dressed, was the starkest symbol of this collapse. The women bound to him by duty had no shields, no voice, and no choice. They existed at the mercy of a prince who could swing between obsession and destruction in the span of moments. These acts revealed a deeper unraveling. They were not simply the cruelty of a spoiled heir, but the symptoms of a man whose illness had become inseparable from power. To Sado, intimacy was not companionship, but control. Each act of violence against wives or attendants deepened his isolation, turning the inner palace into a prison of his own making. What began with phobias and paranoia had now metastasized into coercion and taboo breaking, sealing a reputation that terrified those closest to him and stained the dynasty he was meant to preserve. The pressure of intimacy had already turned destructive, but it was in his relationships with family and court that the tragedy of Sado reached its sharpest edge. With Lady Hyegyeong, his principal wife, there had once been affection. She recorded evenings when they spoke easily, when he shared poems and small confidences. But as his mind darkened, affection gave way to fear. She managed his affairs quietly, hiding his secondary consorts in moments of crisis, protecting their children from his sudden violence. Without her constant intervention, the dynasty itself might have collapsed years earlier. His bond with siblings told a different story. He loved his sister Princess Hyegyeong deeply, and when she died in 1752, he mourned with an intensity that shocked the palace. But grief did not soften him. By 1760, he threatened another sister, Princess Hyegyeong, with a drawn sword. This was no passing quarrel, but a terrifying glimpse into how far he had fallen. Even his mother, Lady Hyegyeong, who had doted on him in childhood, now faced tirades of abuse. Sado's family became both his only refuge and his most frequent victims. His role as regent might have offered redemption, but instead it exposed the cracks between father and son. Appointed in 1749, Sado presided over government affairs in theory. Yet Yeongjo undermined him at every turn. He was barred from major rights, stripped of authority in critical matters, and humiliated before ministers who already doubted him. Factional rivalry sharpened the tension, with Noron and Soron scholars feeding his paranoia. What should have been the training ground for kingship became another stage for his humiliation. The consequences for his children were dire. He fathered several, including Isan, the boy who would one day rule as King Yeongjo. But even they were not shielded from danger. At times, he threatened them in rages, driving fear into the very heirs of the dynasty. Lady Hyegyeong shielded them as best she could, hiding her son from his father's outburst and appealing to Yeongjo to intervene. The future of Joseon hung not on Sado's strength, but on whether others could protect his children from him. These relationships reveal the paradox of Sado's life. He was a son who could not please his father, a husband who terrorized his wife, a brother who threatened his siblings, and a father who endangered his children. The paranoia that consumed Sado's final years manifested in ways that shocked even courtiers long accustomed to palace intrigue. By 1762, rumors spread that he plotted against his father, and he began threatening even his own grandchildren. Royal consort Yeong and his mother was said to tremble when he drew near the children, fearing that his fury might extinguish the dynasty itself. These whispers reached King Yeongjo, and they could not be ignored. These threats created terror inside the women's quarters, where maids carried messages back and forth in silence, and even the youngest attendants understood that the heir to the throne had become the greatest danger to it. Ministers wrote cautious memorials to the king, never daring to state the full truth, but hinting that action was required. Yeongjo, now in his 60s, faced the most dreadful decision of his reign: how to preserve the dynasty without staining his hands with the blood of his only son. On July 4, 1762, Yeongjo summoned his son to the palace courtyard. There, before officials and servants, he ordered Sado confined in a wooden rice chest. It was a method chosen precisely because it avoided direct execution. To kill a crown prince by sword would desecrate the royal bloodline, but to seal him in a box was to let nature take its course. The chest was carried into the courtyard and placed under guard. The lid was closed. Inside, Sado cried out for mercy, calling upon his father, his wife, and his children. No reply came. For days, his voice was heard within the chest. Servants reported his muffled pleas, his promises to reform, his prayers shouted into the darkness. On the seventh night, there was still sound, faint but present. By the eighth day, there was none. He had died of heat and thirst, his body collapsing within the wooden coffin of grain that had become his tomb. Those who passed by covered their ears, unwilling to hear the prince's descent into silence. In the aftermath, the court carried on with ritual calm, but behind closed doors, the trauma lingered. Lady Hyegyeong wrote of the horror of that week, when she could do nothing but listen as her husband's voice dwindled. The servants who stood guard at the chest never spoke freely of what they had witnessed, only bowing their heads when asked. Yeongjo himself maintained a mask of authority, but those closest to him knew the decision had scarred him deeply. Years later, the king sought to cloak the act in mourning rather than disgrace. He restored Sado's title as Crown Prince Sado, a name meaning thinking of with sorrow. It was a gesture of regret, a signal that even in punishment, he could not bring himself to erase his son entirely. Yet the memory of the rice chest endured, whispered in the palace as both warning and lament. The dynasty survived, but at a terrible cost. A father had condemned his son, a son had terrified his family, and a court had borne witness to a tragedy it could never forget. The rice chest became more than an instrument of death. It became a symbol of a kingdom trapped between duty and madness, love and fear. And in that symbol, the story of Crown Prince Sado reached its bitter end. There was no autopsy of the prince, no clinical dissection of his madness. What remains instead are the pages of Lady Hyegyeong's memoirs, written decades later, a testimony both intimate and tragic. In them, she portrayed Sado not only as a tyrant within the palace, but also as a victim, crushed by a father's relentless criticism, consumed by illness, and broken by a system that demanded perfection yet offered no mercy. Through her eyes, we see a man at once dangerous and doomed. His story demonstrates how private torment can become public disaster. A son's untreated illness grew into a father's impossible burden, and a dynasty's collective shame. The rice chest that ended his life became a symbol of the cruelty of absolute monarchy, where the failings of one man could endanger an entire realm. Historians still debate whether he was a madman, a victim of paternal abuse, or both. What is certain is that his perversions were not born in isolation, but in the pressure cooker of Joseon's rigid dynastic order. In the end, Sado achieved a kind of immortality, though not the kind he desired. His name lived on not as a wise regent or a future king, but as a cautionary tale about the danger of unchecked authority and untreated illness within absolute monarchy. He left behind scars that his son Yeongjo tried to heal but never erased. The most perverted prince in history had ended as he had lived, as both victim and perpetrator, leaving only sorrow in his wake. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell to stay up to date on all the nutty stories from humanity's past.